Hello everyone. So today we're going to talk about what was remaining of chapter 16. It's quite a lengthy chapter. You should give it a read. I will go over some of the more important points, right? Last time I had given you some work which was related to, amongst other things, Erikson's idea of generativity, right? So this is the stage when we talk about Erikson's theory, right? So Erikson's psychosocial theory, according to psychosocial theory of Erikson, this is the stage where the conflict is generativity versus stagnation, right? So what this basically means is that either adults who are between 40 to around 65 or 60 years, right, they can either become generative, right, or they can become stagnant. Now what does that mean? Subsequent research, so even with Levinson and another researcher by the name of Vaillant, is that when you reach this stage around in your 50s, you become something, you become this sort of guardian of culture, right? Now what does this basically mean? What this means is that you want to give forward, right? You want to sort of leave a legacy, right? And you want to transcend yourself, right, and give to others. There's another term for this as well, which is that you become a keeper of meaning, that you become the keeper of values. You assume this role in which you are passing on values to the younger generation, right? So you're assuming all of these different roles. The emphasis here is that you're looking out of yourself, in the sense that till now your life had been about forming intimacy. It had been about developing your career. It had been about educating your children, giving them the best possible. But when you're in this stage, right, mostly what you see is that your children have grown up to a certain extent. That's why this phase is sometimes also called, and this is something you'll see in the chapter as you read along as well, is that this is the stage which is called the launching stage, right? What this means is that your children are either leaving for work, or they're getting married and they're leaving the house, right? This was also called, which is a more negative connotation, it was also called the empty nest sort of stage, right? In which what's happening to parents is that children are leaving the nest, and now they're suddenly left with an empty nest, and they don't know what to do, because if you especially structured your life around children, it becomes extremely hard for you to sort of redefine who you are, or fill up that free time that children took up, right? So what you do see here is that in this phase, when you're generative, according to Erikson, what you're doing is that you're passing on values to the younger generation. Your sort of focus is moving towards a more broader perspective, right? You're thinking more in terms of what can you give back, right? So all of these are what make a person generative, right? Whereas when you talk about stagnation, right, what sort of person is characterized by this sort of state in which, according to Erikson, they'd be stagnant? Now they're again someone who is rather sort of focused on taking rather than giving, right? Sort of thinking about themselves. They're more selfish, right? So selfishness is there. They are not concerned so much about younger people and what, the younger generation is getting out of life, right? Some of you, when you were writing, your responses, some of you talked about how a particular person in your family is generative because they're always, sort of asking about your life and taking an interest in it. So yes, with a person who's stagnant, that is something that's definitely not present, right? So they're concerned more about themselves and not so much about, what they can give back. They have no interest in, transcending the self, right? And what you'll see is that this sort of person is more marked by negative emotionality and, their adjustment to this phase of life is also not as much as someone who is more generative, right? What other characteristics would be for someone who is more stagnant? So you're self-indulgent. So there's selfishness, there's self-indulgence, there's being more absorbed in the self, right? And you have little interest in sort of developing other facets of your personality. So you're not really looking at being more productive. That could be in your career, or it could be sort of with your hobbies as well, right? And what you see is that this sort of pattern leads to lower sense of well-being and happiness in this particular phase of life, right? So so this is something that was related to what we've been talking about earlier, right? Now what we talk about is these other facets, because one of the things that you see is that for adults who are more generative, right, what you see is that they're also lower in anxiety. So you have lower anxiety, you have lower rates of depression, and you are high in these other three characteristics, which we look at next, which is that you're basically, because when we're considering changes, right, that are happening in midlife, now there are also arguments related to that. We talked about this in our previous lesson, how there is this controversy whether there is actually a midlife crisis or not. And what we sort of understand from a midlife crisis is that it's something where you're sort of suddenly overwhelmed with thoughts about what your life has been about, and you're now reconsidering what it ought to be about, right? But when you actually do research, this is actually sort of a popular opinion which you watch in movies or read about in books. But when you do research, a lot of adults who are in this state of life, and you ask them to reflect on how much they've changed or how much they feel that this is a time of turmoil, because that's how it's portrayed. This is the whole idea of a midlife crisis, that it's marked by turmoil, right? What you find is that self-reports of adults do not add up with this, that a lot of adults do not report seeing this time as a period of turmoil, right? Rather, there are certain gains in different facets of personality. So we'll consider three of those. One of the things that you see is that adults in this age range, right, they are a lot more self-accepting. Now, what does this mean? This is related to another idea, which is that of the self-concept, right? And this the self-concept is sort of related to possible self, Now, what do we mean when we say possible self? Right? What we mean by possible self is everything that you can dream of in terms of, I want to be this, or I want to be that, or I want to, so for example, at the stage which you're at, when you're young adults, right, you might be thinking, oh, I want to be a researcher, or sometimes you might think, no, that's something I'm not so interested in. I, rather be part of the corporate world, or I'd be a politician, or I'd be an analyst, right? So all of these, so this is just related to career, right? Some of you might think that I want to be, I don't know, a parent, right? Or I want to be, a very supportive spouse. So all of these different, selves are possible selves, right? They are everything that you can sort of dream of being, and at present, right, your possible selves are many, right? So when you're younger, you have a greater number of possible selves, right? With obviously, when you choose a major and you start specialize, possible selves also decline, right? But compared to when you're a young adult, and when you're an adult who falls in this age range, which is between 40 to 60 years, your possible selves, what they do is that they decline, right? Why is that? Because you have made certain choices. You're at that part of life where you're already have chosen a career, where you possibly also have a family. So possible selves decline, and more work is now done on being, or sort of living up with what the self is about at that age, right? So sort of, what would be the word of it, sort of grooming the self, not so much, but sort of being most productive with what the self is at the present. So for example, if you're a parent, right, so you want to be a great parent, but because you are a parent already, so not being a parent is no longer a possible self, right? The possibilities then is, what sort of parent are you? Are you a supportive parent? Are you a permissive parent? Are you an authoritarian parent, right? So in that sense, in this stage, right, in midlife, your possible selves are declining, right? And emphasis is shifting on what you could possibly be to being whatever you are, right? Accepting whoever you are and trying to be that person in a better way, right? So that's one thing that's happening, right? When we talk about self-concept, so possible selves are selves that are, it is related to other people, but possible selves are something that you can modify as you go along, right? Now, when we talk about self-concept, what is self-concept? It's the idea that you have about yourself. There's one thing that we talked about when we were talking about cognitive changes that are happening in midlife, and we came across this term, which is called cognitive affective complexity. Now, do any of you remember what this was? So what cognitive affective complexity is that you sort of are able to integrate, right, different facets of the same phenomena, right, and think about them in a very complex fashion. So for example, you might say that you might be able to integrate both positive and negative facets of a particular phenomena, and you might be able to recognize that you feel about this certain thing, whatever it is, right? It could be a friend, it could be an institution, it could be a subject, right? So let's say it's psychology, let's say it's developmental psychology, to be more exact, right? Now you could say that if you have what is called cognitive affective complexity, you could recognize that there are certain areas of developmental psychology that you greatly appreciate. You understand that longitudinal and cross-sectional research, which is used in developmental psychology, can provide valuable insights about the human condition and about a person's growth, right? But there are some problems as well, which could be that when you're always looking at human development a particular way, when you're looking at research, especially if you're looking at self-reports and that's how you are gathering data, one of the problems could be that self-reports mostly are not reliable, right? So that's a negative of developmental research, that developmental research in developmental psychology, that you don't know how valid it is, right? Now this is thinking about cognitive developmental psychology in this sort of framework, but cognitive affective complexity is something more also. It's also how you feel about certain things, because perhaps by now you might have sometimes noticed that you have contradictory feelings about the same thing, right? So sometimes you might feel that you love developmental psychology, right? But sometimes you may feel, so let's talk about a person. Sorry for my drawing. Sometimes you might feel that you really admire this person, right? And at other times you might feel that you hate this person, right? You detest them, you're annoyed by them, right? Now, feeling like this towards the same person is very normal. Like, it's not that you have some sort of disorder, that sometimes you feel about a particular person a particular way. But if you have what is called cognitive affective complexity, right, you would be able to integrate these different feelings that you have into a complex whole. You might be able to say, I admire this person for this quality that they have, right? But I really get annoyed. So hate is a very strong word. So we can perhaps say, I get extremely annoyed when they act this particular way, right? So you're able to sort of say with more complexity how your feelings towards this person are, and you're able to integrate them. Does that make sense? Right? So similarly, what's happening with self-acceptance, right, is that you're becoming more accepting. When you talk about self-acceptance, you're becoming more accepting and more real, right, about your strengths, right, and your weaknesses, right? When you're younger, sometimes what might happen is that if you sort of have some sort of weakness, or you recognize some sort of weakness, that might make you feel extremely upset. But with middle age, with cognitive affective complexity, your self-acceptance seems to get better. You have a much more real idea of what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, right? So that's one thing that's changing. Another facet that's changing is something that is called autonomy, right? So you're becoming much more autonomous, right? Again, this could be with the sort of experience that you're feeling, right? It could be that you're one sort of characteristic of being more autonomous is that you are less sort of worried about other people's opinions, right, or their judgments, and you are okay with sort of evaluating yourself using your own standards, right? So again, self-evaluation with own standards, right? So you're less worried. Let's say you choose to wear, when you're younger, you're extremely sort of caught up in mostly young adults are very caught up in what someone thinks of them, how they feel about them. But by middle age, you're less worried about being judged, by others for whatever it is that you choose to do, and you start self-evaluating using your own self-chosen standards, right? So if, for example, other people think that your career choice is extremely strange, you're not so much affected by that anymore as you were when you were younger. So in that sense, you are more autonomous, right? The third is that you have more of what is called environmental mastery. Now, what is that about? Now, environmental mastery is that you are able to manage, a variety of tasks with varieties of complexity, right? So, the management of a variety of tasks. Because, see, by this time, you have probably taken on multiple roles, right? If you're following a very typical social clock, by this time you're married, you probably have a career, right? So you have juggled, different facets of your life. You have, by this time, juggled a career with raising children or with having a family. So, by this time you already know that you are capable of this, and this leads to you having this higher sense of environmental mastery, right? So this is something that's coming with experience, right? So you're actually when we were talking about psychosocial changes, so you are actually gaining on all three of these different facets when you are in middle age, right? One thing that sort of goes hand in hand with this is that you're becoming better at coping strategies. Now, we've talked about this earlier as well when we talked about stress management in the previous chapter, right? But what you see is that middle-aged adults are mostly better at looking at the silver lining in whatever situation that they have. They are usually more up for sort of waiting before making a decision, or delaying making any sort of decision until they consider different alternates to whatever situation that there is, right? And they really weigh a particular situation before taking any action, right? And we talked about this earlier as well, that adults in this age range use a combination of emotion-centered and problem-centered coping, which makes for sort of better problem solvers, right? So yeah, so coping strategies are something that are also evolving during this stage. There's a relationship between how coping strategies are evolving actually, and what we've discussed here in terms of self-acceptance, autonomy, and environmental mastery. In the sense that when you're self-accepting, when you understand your own strengths and weaknesses, then you're also able to cope better, right? So that's another part of it, definitely. What else? Even though one of the things that you see is that even though we say that coping strategies are evolving, it's not necessary that middle-aged adults do not have stressors in their life. They do, but those stressors, the way they affect them, the way that they deal with them, that is essentially what is changing, right? Next, we look at what are some of the factors that contribute towards happiness during this stage. So some of them are basically something like it's interesting how a good marriage also sort of influences your happiness during this time, right? Factors that influence happiness in or life satisfaction in midlife. So one of the first of these is marriage, right? So a good marriage, it's not just any marriage, but a good marriage, good companionship, right? Then you also have something that's called you also definitely have health. Someone who's healthy, is not ill, is obviously happier, right? You have perceived sense of control. Then again, you have different social relationships, and this is one of the things that you see, and we talk about this, you can read about it in the chapter as well, that social relationships are actually increasing in midlife as children get married, right? And you start off on this journey of grandparenthood, right? And this is a phase of life that can be very, very satisfying for a lot of middle-aged adults, because grandparenthood provides you opportunities to truly be generative, in the sense that you can take an interest in your grandchildren's life, you can help with the sort of care that they receive. A lot of grandparents now play very active roles in raising children. But we'll consider how grandparenthood can be stressful as well, because sometimes we have what are called skip generation families, right? In which what's happening is that the parent, right, they're either ill, or they're so involved in drug usage, or they're downright abusive towards children, or they're out of control, that they cannot take responsibility for the children. And in such cases, grandparents step up and they take custody of the children. That can have detrimental effects on grandparents' health as well, because perhaps financially they're not able to care for the children, and physically as well, they're not able to meet the demands of young children the way that their parents would have been able to. And they're sort of stuck in that situation where they're sort of struggling and wanting to be a grandparent more than a parent, because one of the factors of, or one of the sort of key characteristics of grandparenthood is indulgence, indulging children in particular ways, right? So that skip generation families do sort of pose this kind of problem. Anyway, so coming back to the factors that promote happiness during this stage, so we have good marriage, we have health, and we also have exercise related to that. Then we have a sense of control, we have social relationships, which we saw was is something that's increasing as you age, right? Then you also have again, mastery of multiple roles. So if you have had that, you are bound to feel more happy or content, right? So yes, so these are some of the factors that go into it, right? Social relationships need not just be with grandchildren. They can also be sometimes young middle-aged adults, they sort of get in touch with siblings, or they start being more about family in that particular way, that they start reconnecting with siblings who have perhaps moved away after getting married, or they become something that are termed kin keepers, in the sense that when children move away, right, they become the person, mothers especially take on this role, that they become this person who gathered all the family back at on holidays. They make sure that everyone is staying in touch with each other, so they become sort of the the relay in the family relationships, right?